History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 3, The Classical Mediterranean. Chapter 2, The Greeks. The city state was shared inheritance and experience of the Greeks, but they knew of other types of political organization through contacts made in the course of trade and because of the exposed nature of many of their settlements. The Greek world had frontier regions where conflict was likely. In the West, they were once seemed to be pushing ahead in an almost limitless expansion, but 2 centuries of striking advance came to an end around about 550 BC, when Carthaginian and Etruscan power prescribed a limit. The first settlements, once again, at sites sometimes used centuries earlier by Minoans and Mycenaeans, show that trade mattered as much as agriculture in their foundation. Their main strength lay in Sicily and in southern Italy, an area significantly to be called Magna Graecia in later classical times. The richest of these colonies was Syracuse, founded by Carthaginians in 733 BC and eventually the dominating Greek state in the west. It had the best harbor in Sicily. Beyond this colonial area, settlements were made in Corsica and southern France at Marseilles, while some Greek went to live among the Etruscans and Latins of central Italy. Greek products have turned up even as far afield as Sweden, and Greek style has been seen in 6th century fortifications in Bavaria. More impalpable influence is hard to pin down, but a Roman historian believed that Greek example, the first civilized the barbarians of what was later to be France, and set them not only to tilling their fields but to cultivating the vine. If so, posterity owes Greek commerce a debt indeed. The vigorous expansion seems to have provoked Phoenician envy and imitation. It led the Phoenicians to found Carthage and the Carthaginians to seize footholds in western Sicily. Eventually, they were able to close down Greek trade in Spain. Yet they could not turn the Greek settlers out of Sicily any more than the Etruscans could drive them from Italy. The decisive battle in which the Syracusans routed a Carthaginian force was in 480 BC. This was a date of even greater significance for Greek relations with Asia, where the Greek cities of Asia Minor had often been at loggerheads with their neighbors. They had suffered much from the Lydians until they came to terms with the Lydian king, Croesus, of legendary wealth, and paid him tribute. Before this, Greece already influenced Lydian fashions. Some of Croesus's predecessors had sent offerings to the shrine at Delphi. Now, the Hellenization of Lydia went even more quickly ahead. Nonetheless, a much more formidable opponent loomed up even further east, Persia. The Greek struggle with Persia is the climax of the early history of Greece and the inauguration of its classical age. Because the Greeks made so much of their long conflict with the Persians, it is easy to lose sight of the many ties that linked the contestants. The Persian fleets and, to a lesser extent, Persian armies launched against the Peloponnese had thousands of Greeks, mainly from Ionia, serving in them. Cyrus had employed Greek stonecutters and sculptors, and Darius had a Greek physician. Probably the war did as much to create as to free antagonism. However deep the emotional revulsion proclaimed by the Greeks for a country which treated its kings like gods. The origins of war lay in the great expansion of Persia under the Achaemenids. In about 540 BC, the Persians overthrew Lydia and that was the end of Croesus, who was supposed to have provoked the assault by an incautious interpretation of an utterance of the Delphic oracle, which said that if he went to war with Persia, he would destroy a great empire, but not which one. This brought Greeks and Persians face to face elsewhere. The tide of Persian conquest rolled on. When the Persians took Egypt, they damaged Greeks' trades interests there. Next, the Persians crossed to Europe and occupied the cities of the coast as far west as Macedonia, across the Danube, and they failed and soon retired from Scythia. At this point, there was something of a pause. Then, in the first decade of the 5th century, the Asian Greek cities revolted against Persia's suzerainty, encouraged perhaps by Darius's failure against the Scythians. The mainland cities, or some of them, decided to help. Athens and Eretria sent a fleet to Ionia. In the subsequent operations, the Greeks burnt Sardis, the former capital of Lydia and the seat of western satrapy of the Persian Empire. But the revolt failed in the end and left the mainland cities facing an enraged opponent. Things did not usually happen very quickly in the ancient world, and large scale expeditions still take a long time to prepare. But almost as soon as the Ionian revolt was crushed, the Persians sent a fleet against the Greeks. It was wrecked off Mount Athos. A second attempt in 490 BC sacked Eretria but then came to grief at the hands of the Athenians in a battle whose name has become legendary, Marathon. Although this was an Athenian victory, the leader in the next phase of the struggle with Persia was Sparta, the strongest of the city states on land. Out of the Peloponnesian League, an alliance whose origins had been domestic in that its aim had been to assure Sparta's future by protecting her from the need to send her army abroad. There developed upon Sparta something like a national leadership. When the Persians came again, 10 years later, almost all the Greek states accepted this, even Athens, whose strengthening of her fleet had made her the preponderant power of the League of Sea. The Greeks said, and no doubt believed, that the Persians came again in 480 BC through Thrace in millions if, as now seems more likely, there were in fact well under 100,000 of them, including thousands of Greeks. This was still an overwhelming enough disproportion for the defenders of the Greek cities. The Persian army moved slowly along the coast and down towards the Peloponnese, accompanied by a huge fleet which hung on its flanks. Yet the Greeks had important advantages in their better armed and trained heavy infantry, a terrain which nullified the Persian cavalry superiority and morale. This time, the crucial battle was at sea. It followed another legendary episode, the overwhelming of Leonidas, the Spartan king, and his 300 at the pass of Thermopylae, after which Attica had to be abandoned to the Persians. The Greeks retired to the Isthmus of Corinth, their fleet massed in the Bay of Salamis near Athens. Time was on their side. It was autumn. A winter which would catch the Persians unprepared would soon be coming, and Greek winters were severe. The Persian king threw his numerical advantage away by deciding to engage the Greek fleet in the narrow waters of Salamis. His fleet was shattered and he began a long retreat to the Hellespont. The next year, the army he had left behind was defeated at Plataea, and the Greeks won another great sea fight at Mycale on the other side of the Aegean on the same day. This was the end of the Persian War. It was a great moment in Greek history, perhaps the greatest, and Sparta and Athens had covered themselves with glory. The liberation of Asiatic Greece followed. It opened an age of huge self confidence for the Greeks. Their outward drive was to continue until its culmination in a Macedonian empire, a century and a half later. The sense of Greek identity was at its height, and men looking back at these heroic days were to wonder later if some great chance to unite Greece as a nation had not then been missed forever. Perhaps, too, it was something more, for in the repulse of an Asian despot by Greek freemen lay the seed of a contrast often to be drawn by later Europeans, though in the 5th century it existed only in the minds of a few Greeks. But myths breed future realities, and centuries later, other men would look back anachronistically to Marathon and Salamis, seeing them as the first of many victories in which Europe confronted barbarism and won. Chapter 3, Greek Civilization. Victory over the Persians launched the greatest age of Greek history. Some have spoken of a Greek miracle, so high do the achievements of classical civilization appear. Yet those achievements had as their background a political history so embittered and poisoned that it ended in the extinction of the institution which sheltered Greek civilization, the city state. Complicated though it is in detail, the story can easily be summarized. For 30 years after Plataea and Mycale, the war with Persians dragged on. But as the background to more important theme, a sharpening rivalry between Athens and Sparta. Survival assured the Spartans had gone home with relief, anxious about their helots. This left Athens undisputed leader of those states which wanted to press ahead with the liberation of other cities from the Persians. A confederation called the Delian League was formed, which was to support a common fleet to fight the Persians, and command of it was given to an Athenian. As time passed, members contributed not ships but money. Some did not wish to pay up as the Persian danger declined. Athenian intervention to make sure that they did not default increased and grew harsher. Naxos, for example, which tried to leave the alliance, was besieged back into it. The League was turning gradually into an Athenian empire, and the signs were the removal of its headquarters from Delos to Athens, the use of the tribute money for Athenian purposes, the imposition of resident Athenian magistrates, and the transfer of important legal cases to Athenian courts. When peace was made with Persia in 449 BC, the League continued though its excuse had gone. At its peak, over 150 states were paying tribute to Athens. Sparta had welcomed the first stages of this process, happy to see others take up commitments outside its own borders. Like other states, Sparta only gradually became aware of a changing situation. When they did, this had much to do with the fact that Athenian hegemony increasingly affected the internal politics of the Greek states. They were often divided about the League, the richer, tax paying citizens resenting the tribute, while the poorer did not. They did not have to find the money to pay. When Athenian interventions occurred, they were sometimes followed by internal revolution, the result of which was often imitation of Athenian institutions. Athens was herself living through struggles which steadily drove her in the direction of democracy. By 460 BC, the issue at home was really settled, so that irritation over her diplomatic behavior soon came to have an ideological flavor. Other things, too, may have added to an irritation with Athens. She was a great trading state, and another big trading city, Corinth, felt herself threatened. The Boeotians were directly the subjects of Athenian aggression. 2. The materials thus accumulated for a coalition against Athens, and Sparta eventually took the lead in it by joining in war against Athens begun in 460 BC. 15 years of not very determined fighting followed, and then a doubtful peace. It was only after almost another 15 years, in 431 BC, that there began the great internal struggle, which was to break the back of classical Greece, the Peloponnesian War. It lasted, with interruptions, 27 years, until 404 BC. Essentially, it was a struggle of land against sea. On one side was the Spartan League with Boeotia, Macedon, and Corinth as Sparta's most important supporters. They held the Peloponnese and a belt of land separating Athens from the rest of Greece. Athens' allies were scattered around the Aegean shore, in the Ionian cities and the islands, the area it had dominated since the days of the Delian League. Strategy was dictated by the means available. Sparta's army clearly was best used to occupy Athenian territory and then exact submission. The Athenians could not match their enemies on land, but they had the better navy. This was in large measure the creation of a great Athenian statesman and patriot, the demagogue Pericles. On the fleet, he based a strategy of abandoning the Athenian countryside to annual invasion by the Spartans. It was, in any case, never capable of feeding the population and withdrawing the inhabitants to the city and its ports. The Piraeus, to which it was linked by two walls some 5 miles long, 200 yards apart. There, the Athenians could sit out the war, untroubled by bombardment or assault, which were beyond the capacities of Greek armies. Their fleet, still controlling the sea, would assure they were fed in war as in peace by imported corn, so that blockade would not be effective. Things did not work as well as this because of plague within the city and the absence of leadership after Pericles' death in 429 BC. But the basic sterility of the first 10 years of the war rests on strategical deadlock. It brought peace for a time in 421 BC, but not a lasting one. Athenian frustrations found an outlet in the end in a scheme to carry the war further afield. In Sicily lay the rich city of Syracuse, the most important colony of Corinth, herself the greatest of Athens' commercial rivals. To seize Syracuse would deeply wound an enemy, finish off a major grain supplier to the Peloponnese, and provide immense booty. With this wealth, Athens would hope to build and man a yet bigger fleet and thus achieve a final and unquestioned supremacy in the Greek world. Perhaps the mastery of the Phoenician city of Carthage and a western Mediterranean hegemony too. The result was the disastrous Sicilian expedition of 415 to 413 BC. It was decisive, but as a death blow to the ambitions of Athens. Half her army and all her fleet were lost. A period of political upheaval and disunion began at home. Finally, the defeat once more crystallized the alliance of Athens' enemies. The Spartans now sought and obtained Persian help in return for a secret undertaking that the Greek cities of mainland Asia could again become vassals for Persia, as they had been before the Persian War. This enabled them to raise the fleet which could help the Athenian subject cities who wanted to shake off its imperial control. Military and naval defeat undermined morale in Athens. In 411 BC, An unsuccessful revolution replaced the democratic regime briefly with an oligarchy. Then there were more disasters: the capture of the Athenian fleet and the finally blockade. This time starvation was decisive. In 404 BC, Athens made peace with her fortifications were slight. Formally, the story ends here, for what followed was implicit in the material and psychological damage the leading states of Greece had done to one another in these bitter years. There followed a brief Spartan hegemony during which she attempted to prevent the Persians cashing the promissory note on the Greek Asian cities. But this had to be conceded after a war which brought a revival of Athenian naval power and the rebuilding of the long walls. In the end, Sparta and Persia had a common interest in preventing a renaissance of Athenian power and made peace in 387 BC. The settlement included a joint guarantee of all the other Greek cities except those of Asia. Ironically, the Spartans soon became as hated as the Athenians had been. Thebes took the leadership of their enemies. At Lectura in 371 BC, to the astonishment of the rest of Greece, the Spartan army was defeated. It marked a psychological and military epoch in something of the same way as the Battle of Jena in Prussian history over 2000 years later. The practical consequences made this clear too. A new confederation was set up in the Peloponnese as a counterweight to Sparta on her very doorstep and the foundation of a revived Messenia. In 369 BC was another low. The new confederation was a fresh sign that the day of the city state was passing. The next half century would see it all but disappear, but 369 BC is far enough to take the story for the moment. Such events would be tragic in the history of any country. The passage from the glorious days of the struggle against Persia to the Persians' almost effortless recouping of their losses, thanks to Greek divisions, is a rounded drama which must always grip the imagination. Another reason why such intense interest has been given to it is that it was the subject matter of an immortal book, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, the first work of contemporary as well as of scientific history. But the fundamental explanation why these few years should fascinate us when greater struggles do not is because we feel that at the heart of the jumble of battles, intrigues, disasters, and glory still lies an intriguing and insoluble puzzle. Was there a squandering of real opportunities after Mycale, or was this long anticlimax simply a dissipation of an illusion? Circumstances having for a moment seemed to promise more than in fact was possible. The war years have another startling aspect too. During them, there came a fruition the greatest achievement in civilization the world had ever seen. Political and military events then shaped that achievement in certain directions, and in the end, limited it and determined what should continue to the future. This is why the century or so of this small country's history would central decades are those of the war is worth as much attention as the millennial empires of antiquity. At the outset, we should recall how narrow a plinth supported Greek civilization. There were many Greek states, certainly, and they are scattered over a large expanse of the Aegean. But even if Macedonia and Crete were included, the land surface of Greece would fit comfortably into England without Wales or Scotland, and of it only about one fifth could be cultivated. Of the states, most were tiny, containing not more than 20,000 souls at most. The biggest might have had 300,000. Within them, only a small elite took part in civic life and the enjoyment of what we think now of as Greek civilization. The other thing to be clear about at the outset is the essence of that civilization. The Greeks were far from underrating comfort and the pleasures of the senses. The physical heritage they left behind set the canons of beauty in many of the arts for 2000 years. Yet in the end, the Greeks are remembered as poets and philosophers. It is an achievement of the mind that constitutes their major claim on our attention. This has been recognized implicitly in the idea of classical Greece, a creation of later ages rather than of the Greeks themselves. Certainly, some Greeks of the 5th and 4th century BC saw themselves as bearers of a culture which was superior to any other available, but the force of classical ideal lies in its being a view from a later age, one which looked back to Greece and found there standards by which to assess itself. Later generations saw these standards above all in the 5th century in the years following victory over Persians, but there is certain distortion in this. There is also an Athenian bias in such a view, for the 5th century was the apogee of Athenian cultural success. Nevertheless, to distinguish classical Greece from what went before, usually named archaic or pre classical, makes sense. The 5th century has an objective unity because it saw a special heightening and intensification of Greek civilization, even if that civilization was ineradicably tied to the past, ran on into the future, and spilled out over all the Greek world. That civilization was rooted still in relatively simple economic patterns. Essentially, they were those of the preceding age. No great revolution has altered it since the introduction of money, and for 3 centuries or so, there were only gradual and specific changes in the direction or materials of Greek trade. Some markets opened, some closed, and the technical arrangements grew slightly more elaborate as the years went by. But that was all. And trade between countries and cities was the most advanced economic sector. Below this level, the Greek economy was still nothing like as complicated as would now be taken for granted. Barter, for example, persisted for everyday purposes well into the era of coinage. It also speaks for relatively simple markets with only limited demands made on them by the consumer. The scale of manufacture, too, was small. It has been suggested that at the height of the craze for the best Athenian pottery, not more than 150 craftsmen were at work making and painting it. We are not dealing with a world of factories. Most craftsmen and traders probably worked as individuals with a few employees and slaves. Even great building projects such as the embellishment of Athens reveal subcontracting to small groups of workers. The only exception may have been in mining, where the silver mines of Laurium in Attica might have been worked by thousands of slaves, though the arrangements under which this was done, the mines belonged to the state and were in some way sublet, remains obscure. The heart of the economy, almost everywhere, was subsistence agriculture. In spite of the specialized demand and production of the Athens or a Miletus, which had something of a name as a producer of woolens. The typical community depended on the production of small farmers of grain, olives, vines, and timbers for home market. Such men were typical Greeks. Some were rich, most of them were probably poor by modern standards, and even now, the Mediterranean climate makes a relatively low income more tolerable than it would be elsewhere. Commerce on any scale and some kinds of entrepreneurial activity were likely to be mainly in the hands of the metics. They might have considerable social standing and often were rich men, but for example, in Athens, they could not acquire land without special permissions, though they were reliable for military service, which gives us a little information about their numbers. For at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, there were some 3,000 who could afford the arm and armors needed to serve as hoplite infantry. The other male inhabitants of the city state who were not citizens were either free men or slaves.